Welcome back to the Happy Saver podcast. I'm Ruth, a personal finance blogger here in Aotearoa. Now, have you ever wondered about other people and their money? Well, I did, so I decided to talk to them. In this podcast, I chat with a diverse bunch of regular people, learn their stories about their financial experiences, and share helpful, relatable information from Kiwis who generously explain how they handle their pūtea or their money in New Zealand. Now, I really enjoyed creating this episode because the focus is on a type of investing that is often not a big part of wealth creation for the people I typically interview. I spoke at length with a woman called Lilly, and she told me about her and her husband James' successful property investing business. For this episode, I have actually changed their names. Now, many people have said to me, Ruth, I know you don't like property as an investment, to which I always say that I have absolutely no issue with property as an investment. But what I do have an issue with is that most people who consider themselves property investors tend not to have assets. They have expensive and time-consuming liabilities. Typically, they are accidental landlords who moved out of their family home into a new home, and they turned around and rented out their former home. Perhaps they go the next step and subdivide that property in two. They tend to have to top up the mortgage using their own PAYE income on their now rental property, and typically have only a small amount of equity in the property due to high debt levels. Mortgage repayments, maintenance, property managers, lawyers, accountants, rates and insurance chew up any rental income that comes in, and few have an exit strategy to liquidate their money into a form that they can actually use. In my experience, an asset makes me money. It doesn't have me paying to own it. And the other thing I've noticed is that because I am plugged into the Financial Independence Network, most property investors are doing the one thing that early retirees in this community are doing their darndest to avoid. They are still working, either at their day job or managing their property. My question is often to ask when this investment will pay them an income. So when I stumbled upon Lilly and learned a little, and now a lot, about how they grew their rental portfolio using math, business savvy, long hours and hard work, I was interested to share how property investment done well can be incredibly lucrative. And I know that there will be some takeaways from this that will get a number of listeners thinking hard about their own investment property. But you know the drill. Before I really get going, a message from today's fabulous sponsor. PocketSmith has many uses, and this one is close to my heart. As a blogger and podcaster, I manage my small business using it. You might manage a trust, rental income, or selling products. PocketSmith can easily do it all. Throughout the month, I categorise each financial move my business makes, and at the end of the tax year, PocketSmith consolidates all my financial transactions and assets into an organised, exportable format that I can share with my accountant. The more efficiently I can provide my financials to them, the faster they can complete my return, saving time and money and reducing errors. And let's not forget the biggest reason I'm a fan of this software: it lets me know exactly how my business is performing. If you want to supercharge your finances with PocketSmith, have we got a deal for you. Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of PocketSmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. That's pocketsmith.com/the Happy Saver. Lilly was born and raised in Germany, and it was just her and I who spoke for this episode. But hers is a journey very much shared with her husband James, who grew up in the Central Otago area, plus also Queenstown Lakes, very much in my neck of the woods. Lily's dad was a high school principal and her mum a legal secretary, and James's dad worked on the Clyde Dam before both his parents actually became restaurateurs in Queenstown. Lilly thinks that both of their families earned what might be called middle incomes, neither high nor low. Of each of their upbringings, Lilly considers her parents to lean on the spender side. She doesn't recall them saving much, just spending their income on family holidays or what have you, whereas James's mum in particular was known to be extra frugal, a trait that she has handed down to James. Now, I only spoke with Lilly for this episode, and due to time constraints, didn't dig too deeply into James's early work life, but it became clear to me very quickly that Lilly had a strong work ethic from the get-go, and without doubt, she has never let up. Once she joined forces with James, they became a couple that got things done. She began working young, doing summer jobs in supermarkets, and from around age 15 or 16, she worked in a local dairy, staying for about 12 years, working mostly just on Sunday, right up until she left to travel. She loved the job, which was close to a train station and had regular bursts of business, and was essentially managing the shop herself, developing strong people skills through constant customer interaction. She started university in 1994 and graduated in 1999, taking longer because she completed both a master's in German literature and linguistics and a Bachelor of Teaching for secondary school. And that was in German and French. She was an A-plus student. Now, tuition was actually free in Germany, and there were no requirements to even attend lectures. So she did miss many lectures because she was working to finance her living, relying on books to learn what she missed. She was not eligible for student loans or allowances due to her parents' income, and her parents told her that if she wanted to attend university, she would need to finance it herself, which she said she did, and it was not that hard to do. She did this by working almost every day and often holding several jobs at the same time. In her early 20s, while studying, she also worked as a trade show hostess where various companies were trying to generate business. A company noticed her work and wanted to hire a young, ambitious woman and offered her the opportunity to organise trade show booths, which would also require her to start her own company and be self-employed. Now, this work was very well paid, she said. It was flexible, and it fitted around her studies. And at the same time, she also worked in a high-end bar in Munich, earning substantial tips. And she managed to juggle it all and earned a lot of money during this period and spent most of it on travel. Now, Australia was her main dream at the time, not New Zealand. She had actually never heard of it, but she secured a 6-month Australian visa, and she spent her time travelling and seeing in person all the Aussie wildlife she had only ever read about. Why Australia? Well, it was just so far away from everything she knew, and she was up for an adventure. She saved 15,000 German marks before leaving, and due in part to one of her main trade show clients wanting her to stay in Germany and organise events across Europe. But the desire to travel was just too great, so they offered her 10,000 Australian dollars and an open-ended contract that she could return to at any time as an incentive to come back after Australia. In 1999, the second her studies were complete, she left for Aussie. The 6 months flew by, at which point she had to leave Australia for 4 weeks, and then they would allow her to return for another 6 months. And she literally went to the airport and asked which country was the cheapest to fly to, and they said, of course, New Zealand. Now, she was low on funds by this point and had just enough money to book a Kiwi Experience fat lap around Aotearoa, and she settled in to pass the next 4 weeks as cheaply as she possibly could before returning to Australia. Now, it was on this trip that her path crossed James's, and it was a day trip to Glenorchy with him that sealed the deal. So they met in 2000 when she was 27 and he was 24. And life is what happens to you while you are busy making other plans, right? Lilly said you have to embrace the world and go where it takes you, and she has kept that attitude to this day. So when her month was up, she continued her travels, but as luck would have it, he was headed to Europe anyway, so their relationship continued to build from that point on. James is clearly quite the salesman though, because by the end of 2002, he convinced her to move to New Zealand, the little country at the bottom of the world she didn't even know existed just a few years prior. And they moved to Dunedin, a city she had never been before. And in 2003, when Lilly was 29, they actually had their first child. Now, James had a Bachelor of Commerce with economics as the major, and he knew for a fact that he wanted to become a real estate agent. Having come from Germany, Lilly thought this to be quite a weird career choice. Being a real estate agent was simply not a career she had ever considered existed. As soon as they landed in Dunedin, he had job interviews, and strangely, she was expected to be in the interview too. Why? Because the employer said that if your spouse is doing real estate, you will inevitably get pulled into it too, because it takes the person away from home so much that the spouse has to be involved. And with a landline in the home, which rang at all hours, that proved very much to be the case from then on. James acquired the relevant qualifications to sell property, and in early 2003 he set to work. He received a $500 weekly retainer, whether he sold a house or not, and this income helped them settle in. He worked hard to begin his career while she worked hard at home raising their baby. Now, since meeting in 2000, I asked how they talked about money. Well, given they were both travelling about and working when it suited or when they needed to, neither had that much money. Each became super frugal so that they could stretch every dollar, and while in Europe, so that they could do fun stuff together, she had been lending him money, which he later paid back, and if she was short, he paid for stuff too. As they exited Europe, she sold her car and brought that money, which was about 10 to 15,000 New Zealand dollars, a sizable sum really, with them to New Zealand. And given she was not a permanent resident, she was unable to open her own bank account to deposit this money. But because he was already set up with a New Zealand bank, they would allow them to have a joint bank account. So, combining finances was done more or less as soon as they got here, out of convenience. It was just the logical thing to do, she said. And James thought the next logical step was to buy a house for themselves, but she wasn't set on the idea. In Germany, renting for life was the norm, and to this day, most of her friends do still rent. But a visit to the bank where they were pre-approved to buy a home up to the value of $100,000 using the money she had brought from Germany as a deposit was all they needed to secure a home of their own. So they did, paying just $89,000 for a Dunedin do-up on a very busy road. They lived frugally, and after just a year in that home, they found it far too noisy, so they sold up, buying another house in a quieter spot just a few streets away. And to this day, if the house is no longer fit for purpose, they never hesitate to sell it and find another one. In 2005, aged 31, they welcomed their second child into their whānau. And with James's career now building and Lilly parenting their two young kids, money was tight, but life was doable. Given James was selling real estate for a living, he had begun talking about owning rental properties themselves, but in those early years, they had no funds to do so. But the idea began to percolate. But her mum receiving a cancer diagnosis in 2006 changed everything for this young family. She was in touch with her mum daily, but it is not the same as being there. And a conversation with her mother's doctor started the ball rolling when they said that for her mum to beat this, all stress needed to be removed from her mum, and having Lilly and her family so far away was stressful. In the short time I've known Lilly, I quickly learned that she is decisive. They had planned to take their kids to Germany one day, and the day was now. So, very quickly, within just a few short months, they sold their home for about $210,000, repaid their mortgage, and in 2006, they moved to Munich, Germany. Housing is a major issue there, she said, and after renting for a few months, and in an effort to settle properly and convince James to stay, given how much she now knew Kiwis like to own the house they live in, they used the equity from their New Zealand house to buy a home. As with their first two homes, this €200,000 home, the middle house in a row of three, was again a do-up. Basically, all their first houses were cheap reno projects, and from early on, they were not thinking of making money from housing. They were really just buying and selling what suited their family. They were always livable, so not derelict, always in a good location with great views. But they always needed a kitchen or bathroom upgrade, painting, tiling, curtains, carpets, wallpaper, and gardening. A lot of cosmetic work going on around them as they lived in it. And whenever possible, they always did the majority of the work themselves, which to this day has been another key part of their success. While in New Zealand, he worked and she parented, but in Germany, because James couldn't speak German, their roles switched. In Germany, they received some government family financial support, She picked up work easily and became their main income earner, working in a sales role for a huge company that needed both her fluent German and English language skills, and he became stay-at-home dad, while also renovating their home and picking up some new DIY skills from her family. Meanwhile, thank goodness, her mum made her way back to good health, and it was her that noted that James was wilting like a flower. Although he loved hanging out with the kids, they were reaching school age, and while he did a great job working on their home, he had no career, and without a double income, they didn't feel they could get ahead. With the language barrier, as much as he wanted to, he could never feel fully part of everyday life. And it was Lily's mum who said, "I hate to admit it, but you have to take him back to Aotearoa, his home." So, at the end of 2008, now aged 35 and 32, they moved back here. Now, naturally for these two, given their German house was no longer required, they decided to sell it. They had a sale lined up, which would have meant that they would at least break even, but right before it was officially under contract, the 2008 global financial crisis scuppered the deal. Their offer was lowered by €100,000, which, if the sale went through, would leave them €100,000 in debt. And she said it felt crazy to have debt and no asset. So they spent more money on the property to get it rental ready, then rented it out in the hope that the housing market would recover in time. Now, Germany's rental housing market strongly favours tenants because housing is treated as a social good rather than a purely financial asset, and this philosophy is deeply embedded in law and policy. Long-term renting is the norm. A majority of Germans rent for life and treat it as their own home. So, lawmakers built robust tenant protections to ensure stability. Indefinite leases are standard, rent increases are tightly regulated, evictions are difficult and slow, and landlords generally cannot terminate contracts. At the same time, Germany has historically prioritised preventing housing speculation and maximising investor returns, accepting lower yields and higher regulation as the trade-off for social cohesion, predictable living costs, and residential security, benefits that flow overwhelmingly to tenants rather than landlords. So, with this in mind, she knew they could be in it for the long haul. Her brother lived close by, which was helpful, but ultimately, Lilly would have to manage it from New Zealand. Added to their trouble was that the rent was not enough to cover the mortgage payment, and they had to top it up by $100 to $200 per month. So once their tenants moved in, as landlords, they had little say over their property, not even the right to visit. And they certainly couldn't ever ask their new tenants to leave. They just had to hope that one day they would move out, and that when they did, the house had gone up in value and they could finally sell it. So they returned to Dunedin in late 2008, totally broke, no savings, no money. They found a place to rent in a cheap suburb, and James went straight back into real estate, but this time with no retainer. He wouldn't get paid until he made his first sale, and the global financial crisis was not helping him over here either. He didn't qualify for the unemployment benefit, but now that she had residency, she was able to go on a job seeker's benefit while she looked for work. The housing market was flat, but so was the job market. It was a tough time for them both. She worked a few hours at different schools in the area in teaching roles, but couldn't cobble together a stable income. So it was time for a new strategy for this broke duo. She decided to return to full-time study to get a qualification that would allow her to teach in New Zealand. A lifeline was that she paid for her course using a student loan, and she also borrowed as much as she could on her student debt for living costs so that they could eat and pay rent. Plus, she received a government-funded student allowance, all the while James worked hard to sell houses. This year of study immediately paid off, and once done, Lilly found getting work in schools really easy. Her German degrees only became relevant once she got the New Zealand qualification to match. She jumped around schools in the area until she landed a permanent role in 2012, which she stayed in until 2018. And all the while, James sold houses for others, then set up his own very small real estate business where he employed just one other agent. But jumping back a little, in 2009, a year after they returned, they managed to buy a house of their own again. they had scrimped and saved, paying $200,000 and taking on a large mortgage to buy in the same street they had left 3 years ago. The housing market had not changed while they were away. For a period of time, she said that they just plodded away working and raising their tamariki. But as she worked through her timeline, it was pretty clear to see that they were both gathering up skills and knowledge. Now, remember how all those years ago Lilly ended up in James's job interview because spouses, whether they liked it or not, tended to get involved if their partner was a real estate agent. Well, she also got her real estate license. Not that she wanted to sell houses, but because before cell phones, everyone rang his office or his home phone when they needed him. And when he was out working, which he always was, buyers would ask her questions, which without the proper paperwork she was forbidden to answer. So, now qualified, she could answer the basic questions, and that led to her helping him behind the scenes with contracts or working with lawyers and doing that back-end office work required for anyone buying or selling a property. She learned a lot during that time. And what became clear as we spoke is that their teamwork is central to helping them make decisions, and it's got them to where they are today. This comes in part from each having walked in the other's shoes for a decent period of time. Each had been the only breadwinner, and each had been the main caregiver to their 2 children, so they both really appreciated each other's efforts to build their family. And Lilly shared that while in Germany, she hated the pressure of being sole income earner in a country where your husband can't speak the language. It meant that every bit of admin, from paying the phone bill to booking in the car for a waff, fell to her, and it felt like a lot. Once back in Aotearoa, the deal was that he would do all the household admin that she hated, and to this day, he still does. And as a result of them both having a lot of insight into household admin, neither of them has any loyalty to any provider of any service. Without hesitation, they will shop around and chop and change to whomever is providing the best service at the best price. As the kids settled into schools and Lilly and James were commuting to work, the time spent in the car was becoming a bit of a problem. They had learned from other families that constantly driving back and forth was untenable. So in 2013, a year after she secured a full-time job, they bought a home in Dunedin City within walking distance to their children's school. And given she was now earning an income, regular payments started being deducted from her salary and sent to her student loan, which was paid off relatively quickly. After putting in offers on other houses and missing out, which was a bit gutting, they found a derelict house that had sat empty for about 10 years. It was an estate sale, and their bank had given them approval to spend up to $500,000. It smelled of cat pee and was unlivable in its current state, but with only one other bidder, they bought it with a mortgage for $340,000. They had been planning to sell their current home, but they now needed to live in it just a little longer until they could renovate and move into this latest property. And also, the hesitation to sell was because by now, in 2013, they had begun to talk more about buying rental housing as a way to grow wealth. Ideas were brewing. Back in 2011, Lilly, who was then aged 38, had started to search for information about money, and she had come across the FIRE movement. She read the book Playing with Fire by Scott Rykins, and also found the OG of early retirement, Mr. Money Mustache. After running some math, the idea that they could each retire by the age of 45 intrigued her, and she told James about it. But given she was now in her late 30s, pursuing FI by slow and steady investment using her paycheck into an ETF or index fund year upon year just felt incredibly slow, so she kept researching. Between 2011 and 2013, information and opportunities started to appear that got them both thinking. By now, James was selling a lot of real estate and making a lot of money. They had income they could invest, but how? The share market or property? He sold houses to a lot of out-of-towners, and they told him how they would borrow against their Auckland, Wellington, or Tauranga house to buy a rental property in Dunedin where houses were cheaper. Then it became apparent that they needed a decent, on-the-ground property manager to look after these properties. Now, this type of work really appealed to Lilly, so while working full-time as a teacher, she also started her own rental property management company and began to manage the rental properties that James had sold to those out-of-town buyers. As she began to work with these people, they told her more about how to use debt to buy property. So, given investing a portion of your take-home pay into a single massive ETF that invested in all the world's top companies, leaving it alone and letting them grow was slow, she started looking further into buying property as a way to make money more quickly. In 2013, she read a book that completely changed their lives, and it got them started as property investors. She read it, and particularly in the beginning, she literally followed it to the letter, and she still references it today. It is called How to Grow a Multi-Million-Dollar Property Portfolio in Your Spare Time by Michael Yardney. Originally released in 2006, he has since updated it many times. Lilly said that this book is just as relevant today, so if you hanker after becoming a property investor, perhaps go out and find it. He outlines a step-by-step action plan showing you how to achieve wealth through property investment, and while it is Aussie-based, she said it works here too, and to this day, when she rereads it, she still gets snippets from it. She credits that book with the successful property deals they began to make after following his advice. Lilly said that it is easy to acquire 1 or 2 rental properties, which is when most people stop, but to get beyond 10, as they did, is an achievement that doesn't happen by accident. You have to treat it like a business. So, with that being said, at this point, they have bought a second property and are preparing it to be their home, while they remain living for just a short while longer in their other house. So what happened next? She explained that in order to make money from property, you have to follow certain principles, and one of them is that rental return needs to correlate with the value of the house. Once they moved into their newly renovated house in 2013, they rented out their original property, the one that they paid $200,000 for. The rent was $300 a week. For a $200,000 investment, this was nowhere near the return that Yardney said they should be getting. The book told her this was not a good investment. It said that if you want to succeed, you are not waiting around for capital gains. They are the cherry on top. You have to make owning rental property a business. And the book actually says that your intention is to never sell a property once you own it. So their first rental property was not ideal. The section was too big at almost 1,000 square meters. The rent was too low because it was not close enough to the city, and the house only had 3 bedrooms, not enough to charge more rent. But the section did have a sleep out on it, and this is where their renovation skills came to the fore. Without having to subdivide, just put up a fence to give the illusion of a separate dwelling, they went through all the appropriate channels with their local council to convert it into a 1-bedroom house in its own right. It had its own rubbish bins, they paid additional rates on it, and now, from an investment perspective, the property made sense. They now had a 3-bedroom house and a 1-bedroom house, rented today at $610 and $390 a week, respectively. All in, they paid $250,000, including the renovation, to now, in today's money, earn $1,000 a week in rent. So, repurposing their original property, which they rented for the first time in 2014, worked out. The math worked out. And this got them thinking that it could be a lot quicker than growing wealth via the original FIRE idea of investing in index funds. A different kind of fire had been lit. They needed to create income-generating projects, and in 2013-2014, they went for it, working every hour of the day that they could to make money. She worked as a full-time teacher, and at its peak, she was also managing 60 rental properties for others before selling this business for $130,000 in about 2019, giving them a lump sum to buy more property of their own. But by 2013, James had branched out on his own, taking on one other agent, and was earning over $200,000 gross a year. He was super busy, and his phone never, ever stopped ringing, she said. She estimated that during this time, they were earning about $400,000 a year gross and becoming more and more interested in buying more property. I wondered if, given she had read and learned about ETF or index investing, she also invested in the share market. It felt like a missed opportunity to not take even just a small piece of your income to invest for long-term growth, just so they could have had another asset building quietly off to one side, as she had read about on blogs and in books. Well, she did begin a small investment, only to sell it all again, but it was something that she was to come back to. So basically, they had a lot of income coming in that she wanted invested into housing as soon as possible. Now, during this period, they began to work with a mortgage broker, and it's the same one they use today. And they were a huge help as they began to look for property to buy that would be profitable. They showed them that it's easy to buy the first one or two, but the trickier deals came later when buying properties 3, 4, 5, and beyond. Commonly, that is where people stall, and that is where you need more insight as to what is possible. Banks tend to love owner-occupied housing because you can take out a mortgage on it and the banks know you won't default because it's your own home. So using their own home as collateral was key, and it would allow them to enter into multiple deals to catapult their buying. Yardney's books had said that you don't just stay with one bank. They will shut you down once you reach a certain level of debt. So if you want to grow the number of properties you own, you need to spread your debt across banks, which was hard and it took time. They were pushing to leverage themselves to the maximum, and banks, sensing risk, were pushing back. From the start, Lilly and James were comfortable with taking on what would become millions of dollars of debt as they went searching for higher yielding rental properties, which would help them service that debt. They didn't invest for capital gains, and they were very clear that the numbers have to work, and if your situation changes and the numbers change, and it doesn't make sense to keep a property, sell it. You just can't be emotionally attached to a property. The math has to work, which from my experience is where a lot of wannabe property investors fall down. Now, one piece of wisdom that she took from the book is that whatever you are buying, it needs to set you up for the next purchase. Otherwise, you buy a property and you are then stuck. Every property they bought was one that a tenant wanted to rent, and it set them up to buy the next one, and in the bank's eyes, the math would work. And her advice is to figure out what the bank wants and work to that. In late 2014, they bought a tiny batch in Central Otago, so they had a small holiday base to ski from, which you might have deduced went against the advice of the book. To buy a holiday home for just their use is not exactly a productive asset. But we all make allowances for our investment decisions, and theirs was that they had a high income to service the mortgage, they didn't spend money on boats or cars, and the property had very low outgoings. And as their knowledge and confidence grew, they kept searching for more property to buy. The book said that the math has to work in their favour, and despite looking all over Dunedin, they couldn't find a property that made the numbers work. The rents they could charge were just not high enough, so she began to look nationwide before settling on Tauranga. In 2015, they paid $225,000 for a property in Tauranga, which they rented for $400 a week, and they now receive $600 a week for that same property. In 2016, they bought a second house in Tauranga. By now, the market had gone up, and they paid $283,000, and it now earns $600 a week. Before they could get each of these Tauranga houses rented, though, they had repair work to do, and the best way to save money and get the outcome that you want is to do it yourself. So they waited until the school holidays, they took their kids up north with them, put them in a school holiday program during the day, and then Lilly and James worked on the house all day. And at night, they all camped in the house, living in a building site to keep costs low at all times before repeating their hard work the next day. So these two know what hard work looks like for sure. As soon as it was done, tenants moved in and they left. Lilly uses a relatively simple formula to decide if a rental property stacks up. Every $100,000 you borrow from the bank costs $100 a week in payments, based on interest rates in the 3 to 4% range. To make a property work, you want double that, giving you enough rental income to cover rates, insurance, and other outgoings. Meaning that for every $100,000 you borrow, you want $200 in rent. So the home I just mentioned that they paid $283,000 for is making $600 a week in rent, which is slightly in excess of what they need it to make. In 2017, they paid $213,000 for, in her words, a crap 4-bedroom house in a very cheap area of Dunedin, which they now rent for $665 per week. When they buy a house in poor condition, they usually budget to spend under $50,000, and one of the key ways they keep the outgoings low is that they do the majority of their renovation work themselves, only calling in key tradespeople when needed and ensuring that they do as much of the prep work for that tradie as they possibly can, so that they can then step in to do the work and then leave, which keeps their chargeable hours way down. Now, as I was hearing her say this, I was thinking of all the Instagram reels I see of suit-clad rental property investors in New Zealand touting this form of investment as passive. It is anything but. If you want to make money, you have to reduce your outgoings, and doing the mahi yourself is one way to do this. What they have done is create a core group of professionals that they work with time and time again. They use the same accountant, lawyer, mortgage broker, plumber, builder, electrician, etc. for most jobs. They stick with the same people and have excellent relationships with them all. They might want to use them as little as possible, opting to do as much work as they can, but when they do employ them, they pay them well, and it's a real win-win situation, she said. The only personal business they are not loyal to is the banks. It is just business. Without fuss, they will switch their business, whether that be a mortgage or a credit card, whenever it's in their financial favour to do so. Yes, it's a juggling act, but they are not exclusive with any bank. In 2018, they bought a large 5-bedroom house in Queenstown for $670,000, and she said that they had to work hard with the bank to get this deal over the line, refinancing their own home in the process. It is a house that is rented by the room for a total of $1,000 a week, which is common in Queenstown, and the rental numbers worked well from the start. Today, it's rented for $1,320 a week, and they live close enough to manage it themselves. They manage all of their properties themselves still. But it was by no means plain sailing with this property. It suffered major damage in 2019 when a fire started in the neighbouring property. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the house had extensive damage, and after a lengthy insurance negotiation, they were eventually paid out the maximum sum insured. But the borrower is slave to the lender, and the bank sensed that their asset was in jeopardy. They wanted their money back in the form of that very insurance payout. It was quite the fight, and it essentially meant that they couldn't do a full rebuild as they didn't have the funds for it, leaving them little choice but to do most of the work themselves to keep the costs low. So they put in a new kitchen, bathroom, flooring, windows, everything, which was an enormous amount of work right in the middle of COVID, just to add to the tension. After about 18 months of work, they were able to refinance the property, and by doing this, they were able to come up with a lump sum of $400,000 to try a different type of investing, this time in the share market. In late 2019, they used Craig's Investments to construct their own portfolio of shares. A financial advisor gave them advice and suggestions, and ultimately they picked their own stocks to buy, invested their money, watched how it performed during COVID, only to sell it all in 2021 to buy a do-up property in Christchurch. They had tried to get lending on this property instead, so they didn't have to sell their shares, but due to the earthquake damage on the property, banks wouldn't lend on it, so they cashed in their shares instead, which she said had made them quite a bit of money. Talk about a high-risk investment strategy to pick stocks and start to invest during a global pandemic. But her view is common amongst property investors. They transfer their busy skills into this new investment, mistakenly believing that being involved by picking stocks and doing stuff is the key to investment success. Whereas what I know to be true is that picking a giant fund and leaving it alone is the higher returning investment strategy. It's very common in my experience for property investors to sell out of shares too quickly, foregoing the rule that share investing is a long-term strategy and money invested needs to stay invested for the long term, which is 5 years plus. But by 2018, they had done a lot of work, coped with a few major setbacks, but had 5 plots of land with 6 houses rented out, plus their own home and a very small holiday home. by my estimates, they had about $2.23 million of property and a lot of mortgage debt. And then something very big happened to them. After 10 long years, the tenants in their German house, they moved out. For 10 years, Lilly had paid their $100 to $200 a week towards their fixed mortgage. Lilly went over there and did some renovations and then sold it privately. The house had gone up in value, and once the mortgage was paid off and all expenses had been deducted, they ended up with 800,000 New Zealand dollars. Then the conversations began about what to do with $800,000. How far could they make it stretch? They decided to ring a bank directly, and they made a deal to get pre-approval to buy property up to $2.2 million in value. Unsurprisingly, legal and banking complexities were just gathering steam. Their family home was in a trust, and the 5 rental properties plus the holiday home were in a company. And now, with this new money coming into the business, their accountant advised them to set up another company and to buy additional property within that company. The reasoning being apparently that it's not advised to let one company become too large. Now, during 2018-2019, they used that $800,000 of cash to secure $2.2 million of debt to purchase 5 more rental properties for a total of $3 million of new property in their rental portfolio, bringing their total up to about $5.23 million at a rough estimate. They bought a 3-bed property in Dunedin for $320,000, rented at $610 a week, a $370,000 3-bed house in Central Otago, rented for $550 a week, an 8-bed student rental in Dunedin for $520,000, now rented at $1,280 a week, a 3-bed do-up house in Dunedin that they paid just $123,000 for, which rents for $440 a week, a Dunedin house which they were only allowed to view from the outside, bought for $189,000 that they now rent for $540 a week. They then went on to purchase 3 more by moving money around and increasing their debt. At their peak, they had over $4 million in debt, but were feeling very confident in the houses that they had purchased. In 2019, they purchased another Dunedin student rental, this one with 11 bedrooms for $770,000, which now rents for $2,000 a week. A Dunedin house that has 2 flats that rent for $1,000 total, which they paid $420,000 for. Given this property has a large enough section, they are actually in the process of building a small dwelling on the back of this property to also rent out. Then, in Christchurch this time, they paid $282,000 for a very small house they rent at $400 per week. This is about to undergo a huge renovation, and they intend to move into it themselves soon. They subdivided the $370,000 Central Otago house, sold off the original house, and built a new dwelling on the section they created, and this is to be sold shortly too. Now, you don't have to be keeping a running tally of what they bought, subdivided, sold, and rented, because I think that even once you did catch up, their situation would have changed. It's hard to keep up. What is important is that Lilly was keeping up the entire time. Remember that Lilly once ran her own property management company? So when it comes to keeping track of their own property, she keeps a very detailed spreadsheet for every aspect of their property. They have a large number of tenants spread across their properties, and while some stay very long term, others change in and out more often, particularly tertiary students. So she has created her own systems for managing rents, bonds, etc., so she knows who is coming and going and when. Her spreadsheet also includes what they owe, what they earn, etc., and basically she shared a few numbers with me that shows the extent of their property investment business. So this is a rough idea of their current situation. They currently own 13 properties, including the house that they currently live in. The purchase price of these current properties was $4,615,000. The purchase dates range from 2009 to 2021. The current estimated value of all 13 is $8,455,000. Having sold some property recently, their total debt is currently down from its peak of $4,200,000 to $2,012,000, giving them a current net worth of $6,443,000. They both now work only on their rental properties and no longer work in real estate, teaching, or property management for others, and their weekly gross rental income is $9,570. But after all outgoings, including tax, their net weekly income or their take-home pay is $3,853 or $200,000 per year. Now, they have gone against the advice of the book they read in a couple of ways. The idea was not to chase capital gains because the book said never sell, but they are selling. They are now wanting to reduce their workload, spend more time traveling, and they no longer want the huge workload owning so many houses brings. The advice was also to pay principal and interest on all mortgages, which they don't. They pay interest only, and when the bank pushes them to pay principal, they renegotiate to stay on interest only. They do this because they are cash flow positive, and even when interest rates moved from historic lows to much higher rates, they never felt any financial pressure because they had cash flow from rental income. They did push their leverage as high as they could at one point and now have pared it back, and they know that they could sell 2 houses and clear the remaining debt easily. But what about the properties they have sold? Why? Well, it comes back to her view that if a property no longer serves its purpose, they sell it. The home in Dunedin that was close to school was no longer needed when their kids finished school, plus Lily and Jane's had moved away themselves, and although they rented it for a year at $800 a week, a number that would excite some property investors, the numbers didn't actually make for a good rental property investment, and they couldn't add any more value to the property to bring that rent up. They paid $340,000 for the house in 2013, spent about $200,000 on its renovation, meaning that it needed to rent at $1,200 a week to break even as an investment property, and given it only ever rented at $800 per week, it didn't fulfill her requirement of a good investment. They sold it for $1,150,000 and took the capital gain, the cherry on top, instead. And remember, particularly for Australians listening to this, in most instances, we don't pay capital gains tax here in New Zealand. Now, I just wanted to talk about yield for a minute, something that I, as someone who doesn't invest in property, was keen to learn a little more about. When Lily talks about return on investment, she's really focused on yield, specifically the net yield. Yield is a way of measuring how hard a rental property is working for you right now, not what you paid for it years ago. And put simply, yield asks the question, if I bought this property today at today's price, how much income would it actually give me? You calculate it based on the current value of the property, not the original purchase price, because that's the true opportunity cost. If your money is tied up in a property, it needs to be earning at least as much as that money could earn elsewhere. Gross yield looks at rent alone, but Lily is far more interested in net yield, which factors in all the real costs like rates, insurance, maintenance, vacancies, and interest. What's left after all of that is the true return. And in my experience, too many people only do half of their math when they purchase a property, or they turn their old house into a rental property. For Lily, if a property doesn't deliver at least 5% net yield, it's simply not worth the effort. Below that, she'd rather put the money into an ETF and enjoy a better return without the stress, the admin, and risk that comes with being a landlord. She also points out that yields nearly always look best when you first buy, and over time, house prices tend to rise faster than rents, which slowly pushes the yield down. And that's why she believes the numbers have to stack up from day one. You can't rely on, it'll be good later. Because making the numbers work is hard, Lily is incredibly deliberate about how she buys. She doesn't just accept an existing floor plan of a property and hope that the rents rise. Instead, she looks for properties where she can manufacture better yield, and that often means reworking floor plans to increase the number of bedrooms, because in many markets, rent is driven by bedroom count, not house size. In older homes, particularly places like Dunedin, that can mean splitting large bedrooms into 2, moving bathrooms around, or redesigning spaces entirely. Garages might be converted into self-contained dwellings, or extra rooms added where council rules allow. Now, all of these changes are about one thing: lifting the rent without dramatically increasing the property's value, which improves yield. Without doing this kind of work, Lilly says the numbers often just don't stack up, and if the numbers don't work, it's not an investment. They have never hesitated to sell a property. Lilly is very clear that property is a tool, not something to hold forever at all costs. If she feels that a local property market and rental market have become stagnant, where rents are unlikely to rise and there's limited potential for future growth, she'll consider selling. At that point, the capital tied up in that property may be better redeployed into another region with higher net yield or into a completely different asset altogether. She's also seen firsthand how property can become a burden later in life. Many investors she's met held onto multiple rentals for too long and eventually struggled with the physical, mental, and administrative load of managing them. Again, property is by no means a hands-off passive investment. That experience reinforced for her the importance of exiting while you still have the energy and the choice, rather than waiting until it feels overwhelming. Right now, that's exactly the stage she and James are at. They've built wealth through property, managed it carefully, and now they're selling into a strong housing market. The goal is to finish well, managing properties responsibly, selling at a good time, and freeing themselves from the day-to-day work, of which there is a lot. Having come full circle, Lilly sees property as an excellent wealth builder, but not necessarily the end game. There were many reasons I wanted to do this episode with her, and her transition out of housing and into a different asset class was absolutely one of them. With their financial goals largely met, she's now actively moving towards index funds and ETFs, aligning with a FIRE-style approach that prioritizes simplicity, liquidity, and freedom of time. A new phase is beginning for Lilly and James, and interestingly, she's right at the start of it. After years immersed in property, she's now researching and learning about a completely new asset class. About 2 months ago, she updated her huge and very impressive spreadsheet to include a new investment, her first ETF. She invested $10,000 into the Smart S&P 500 via InvestNow. And the idea wasn't to go all in straight away. This was a trial run. She wants to watch how that $10,000 behaves, understand the ups and downs, and then mentally extrapolate what that might look like at $100,000 or $1 million. It's her way of learning by doing. While they will still hold some property that makes total financial sense, they are very clear that they want to sell down a significant portion of their portfolio. At their peak, they owned 16 properties, and that was a lot of work. Property is not passive, and Lilly knows this better than most because she works on them every single day. Over the Christmas period, while Dunedin students were away and rentals were empty, she and James spent long days inside those properties, upgrading them and getting them up to spec for the 2026 tenants. That's the reality of property investing. Even when rents are coming in, the work doesn't stop. Now, Lilly has always been very comfortable using leverage, and she sees it as a powerful tool, though she's very aware it carries risk. Some people lose sleep over debt. She never does. And that's because she was always buying real assets on real land, and she had seriously run the math on whether there is income to be made. For Lilly, the title to the land is the key thing. The house sitting on it will deteriorate over time and need ongoing maintenance, upgrades, or replacement, all at a cost. But land is finite. They aren't making any more of it, and over time its value tends to rise. How quickly depends almost entirely on location. In late 2025, they sold 3 properties and paid down debt and have plans to sell more. And just in case you're imagining a life that's all spreadsheets and hard hats, that's not the case at all. They deliberately split their time into 2 very different halves. About 6 months a year, they're in New Zealand doing the unglamorous work of managing and maintaining their rental portfolio, living frugally but not obsessively counting dollars, and then 6 months travelling and exploring the world, managing everything remotely. When it comes to debt, Lily's goal has never been to aggressively pay off those mortgages. She is comfortable with interest-only mortgages. Now, this is something she often debates with other property investors, many of whom strongly disagree with her approach. She said, to take their very first Dunedin rental as an example, they bought it for $200,000 and spent $50,000 renovating it. Today, it's worth around $800,000 and has a mortgage of just $120,000 on it. In that context, she doesn't see the point in stressing about clearing the debt when the underlying asset has grown so substantially. So, while the bank will let them do it, they avoid repaying principal whenever possible. At the end of the day, they have developed a business that makes money, and they could continue leveraging and scale up to 30 properties or more if they wanted to. But at 52 and 49 years of age, they don't want more work. Lilly deducts all outgoings from rental income, council rates, insurance, mortgage payments, and she also sets aside money for repairs. They can access up to $400,000 at any time if major work is needed across the portfolio, and after deducting everything, she can clearly see the true profit from her property. She also tracks their loan-to-value ratios closely, which historically allowed them to push leverage up to around 70%. In the early years, leverage was the focus. These days, yield matters more. So every property they still hold has a yield above 10%. The lowest yielding property, interestingly, is the Queenstown one at 10.24%. The highest yields sit around 26%, with most others clustering near 16%. After all outgoings, they currently take home, as I said, about $3,850 a week after tax, and their rule of thumb is simple. As long as they don't spend more than that each week, everything works. In reality, they usually spend well under $1,000 a week while in New Zealand, and when they travel, they spend to the max, and they get great enjoyment from doing so, as they should. So, where are they trying to get to? Well, while leverage has served them well, they don't want to deal with banks forever. Over time, the plan is to reduce the portfolio to fewer than 5 very strong performing properties. They already know which ones they'll keep. Those remaining properties would generate around $3,500 per week after tax. As each property is sold, the surplus capital will be redirected into ETFs. She is still deciding which ones, but having made a start on the US 500, is leaning more towards just buying a total world fund, which also includes the US 500 anyway. Lilly is still mapping out the end position, but her current thinking is to have around $2.5 million invested in ETFs, and using the 4% rule, that would generate about $100,000 per year, which is roughly $1,900 a week, in truly passive income. If they were comfortable selling down 5% a year, which is now widely accepted, that income would rise to about $125,000 a year or $2,400 per week. And I couldn't help but do the math on them selling their entire portfolio and investing the lot into the share market, which also rises in value over time. If their net worth is $6,443,000, as I estimated above, well, that would give them an annual income of $322,150 per year or $6,200 per week based on the 5% rule. They could truly retire, something to think about. But the end goal for them is a blend of assets, a small number of high-quality property assets with a manageable workload, possibly still carrying some debt, alongside a substantial ETF portfolio that provides a completely passive income. Now, as for timing, well, the sooner the better. They're currently preparing properties for sale, with 3 going on the market in January, February, and also March. And when these two act, they really act. The plan is to sell 2 to 3 properties each year, completing sales during the 6 months that they are in New Zealand and spending the other 6 months enjoying the freedom they've worked so hard to create. Now, as I reached the end, the funny thing was that Lilly had only ever listened to one of my podcast episodes, and that was only because we were going to be sitting down to talk for this one, and she thought it a little long. And I wonder how she feels about this one now. So before I head into one of my longer wrap-ups, a message from today's sponsor. If your finances are holding you back from living the life you want, try Pocketsmith out. They've got the tools to help you make money management easier. And have we got a deal for you? Happy Saver listeners get a whopping 50% off your first 2 months of Pocketsmith's foundation plan. To get your deal, go to pocketsmith.com/The Happy Saver. That's pocketsmith.com/The Happy Saver. Now, first up, a huge thank you to Lilly for sharing what actually goes on behind the scenes of a couple who are true rental property owners and investors. And I very much enjoyed having a peek inside your very busy business. Now, a few key things really stood out to me from speaking with Lilly. She is decisive, probably one of the most decisive people I've met. If a property is no longer fit for purpose, they don't hesitate. They sell it and they move on. There is zero sentimentality, just clear-eyed decision-making. Johnny and I enjoyed her perspective as we think about what to do with our own home at the moment. They've also always done as much of the work themselves as possible, from renovations to ongoing management, which has been a major driver of their success. Teamwork underpins everything. Big decisions are made together, talked through, and then acted on. And they have no loyalty to service providers, especially banks. If something no longer suits their needs, they change it without hesitation. And finally, a key influence on Lilly's thinking has been that book, How to Grow a Multi-Million-Dollar Property Portfolio by Michael Yardney, which helped shape how they've treated property as a business, not an emotional investment. But now we get to the fun part, because all of this planning, the spreadsheets, the buying and the selling actually has a very clear purpose: to enjoy life. They're on a deadline. On the 2nd of May, they're gone, off to travel and explore the world. For tax reasons, they choose to remain New Zealand tax residents, which means spending at least 181 days a year in the country. The rest of the time, they travel. They escape the New Zealand winter and they chase the summer elsewhere. So the first half of 2026 is full on as they prepare their properties for either sale or rent. When they're travelling, they live by a simple rule. They can now spend up to $3,800 a week, and if they go over 1 week, they just spend a little less the next. But more often than not, they actually come home having spent less overall. They travel economy, they take their time getting there, they stop and enjoy the journey rather than rushing from A to B, and they usually aim to be back in New Zealand around October. In 2026, their travels are anything but boring. Europe features heavily, multiple countries at a time, including a Croatian sailing tour, a Danube river cruise, and long bike rides from Germany into Austria. They climb mountains, they prioritise health and movement, and also balance it out with the occasional week in a luxury alpine resort in Austria. Spain has become an annual stop where they dog sit for friends. They will spend time in Dubai, Bali, and Africa, including an 8-week safari. Asia often features on the way home. It's slow, intentional travel, rich in experiences rather than just excess. Now, of course, every time they return home, reality kicks back in. There's always maintenance to do on their properties, and while they are away, they are still managing from afar. There's often been a flood, a storm, or some kind of regional disaster, and tenants are messaging. Some things get fixed immediately from afar, others wait until they're back. There's always a list of things to do. Now, they still manage all their own properties. After years of frustration with poor property management companies, they decided long ago that they'd rather just do it all themselves. They choose their own tenants, and if someone decides to move on, Lilly advertises the property from wherever she is in the world, and sometimes they even reduce rent slightly if a current tenant helps sell the property to the next one. A win-win. Her biggest recommendation for anyone with a rental: read the New Zealand Tenancy Act, then read it again. Know it inside and out. It protects both you and your tenants, and everyone should know the rules. Lilly laughs that being German helps her here. She likes rules, she follows them, and she expects others to do so as well. Any disputes are dealt with quickly and fairly, with or without the tenancy tribunal. There was so much that we didn't get to in our discussion, but we did touch on the fact that they've also lived through plenty of government policy changes, and not all of them were favourable. Losing interest deductibility created a huge financial hit, but governments come and they go. Bright line tests are introduced, rules shift, and as a business, which if you haven't got the point by now, if you want to be a rental property investor, you really need to be running a business, Well, you either adapt or you don't survive. Lilly sees property as a business. When the rules change, the business has to change with them. It's obviously better when interest is tax deductible, especially when interest rates rise and flexibility tightens. But even when rates were climbing, they were never right on the edge. It wasn't comfortable, but they could cope. She estimates they could have handled interest rates rising to 10% before they'd need to sell or return to paid work. Now, both of them quit their salary jobs when they each turned 45, just as she had always planned. She left teaching in real estate, continuing with property management, which grew so much it became a business in its own right. She sold that business in 2019 for $130,000, rolling the money straight into more deals. He also left work at 45, simply closing the door on his real estate career. They're not retired in the traditional sense. They're still working really hard in 6-month stints, just on their own terms. But Lilly is very aware that property doesn't make sense forever. It's hands-on, demanding, and not especially age-friendly. And that's why she's now actively learning about ETFs and global funds, and why the Total World Fund keeps coming up in her thinking. So this next phase is about choosing assets that support the life they want as they age, not just ones that worked brilliantly when they were younger and had endless energy. And honestly, I really love this about them. They're not stuck. They're not stuck in jobs. They're not stuck in assets. They're not stuck in one country even. And they're certainly not stuck in one way of thinking. And in the 16 years since returning to New Zealand, flat broke, they've built a life with options, and they're still curious enough and brave enough to keep evolving it. And that is all from me this week. If you want to get in touch, you know you can find me over at my blog, thehappysaver.com, where I share a lot of information about how I manage my money in my life. Plus, if you sign up for my fortnightly email, I'm always linking to other useful personal finance blogs and podcasts and books and just money-related content. So thank you for listening. I hope you took a few nuggets of wisdom from this episode that you can now go and apply to your own life. And please do share the Happy Saver with your friends. It is the best way that people can learn about the podcast. And I would love it if you would talk more about money with your own friends and whānau and help me continue to help others be better with their money. So until next time, happy saving.